Good afternoon, everyone. Can everyone hear me? Yes, okay. Good afternoon, and I will try to be brief, indeed, not to put too much of a demand on your patience. But yes, indeed, I lead something called the European Economic Summit, and just so you can place where my perspectives are coming from, is we deal with new value-based paradigms on the economy, especially paradigms which emphasize the central role of relationships and mutuality. And we have a second focus area, and that is on transformational businesses being what we see as a viable alternative or solution, for poverty alleviation and also for sustainable economies. And so those are our two main emphases. Now, as I was preparing for this, I needed to look back at our discussion yesterday. And yesterday we talked an awful lot about passion and about motivation and about where does that motivation come from. And so I'm going to start with that as I look at what can and should we expect from responsible businesses. Now, yesterday our moderator gave a very good description of what passion is. Essentially, she said, passion is what happens when you combine purpose with vision. And when those two things meet, then you have passion. And passion in what we are discussing today and also what we discussed yesterday is tremendously important. Why? Because change is hard. And we need passion. And we need motivation in order to be able to persevere and in order to be able to expend the energy that is needed to see change come about. Now, that being said, change may be difficult, but it's been my experience, at least to date, that people will tell you why you cannot do something until you do it. And then you become a thought leader and a trendsetter. And so I don't pay too much attention these days to public opinion in general. Now, for me, I am a non-economist, but passion was ignited in me a few years ago. And there were two things that resulted in stirring up that passion. Number one was an article that I read in a Dutch newspaper. I live in Amsterdam. And that newspaper had the headline, The Lost Generation. And essentially what they were saying was that the generation between 18 and 35 years old is now being called the Lost Generation. And it's being called that because they have no hope of meaningful employment, many of them, in their lifetimes. Now, when I graduated from university and got my PhD, I knew that it would be tough to get a job, but at least I had hope. And one of the words that I'd like to add to this discussion is we've talked about humility, we've talked about joy, we've talked about love this morning, would be the crying and pressing need for hope in our societies. And that's why I think I am here, certainly, with regards to the whole idea of mutuality. But that lost generation, essentially they explained that by the time this crisis clears up, this economic crisis, there's going to be a whole new generation of graduates which will leapfrog over the ones that graduated 3, 4, or 5 years ago. I've got to say that that kept me up at night. And I was thinking to myself, this is not acceptable. A great writer in an ancient book said, the righteous person, the person who does right, leaves an inheritance for their children's children. And so as a result, for me, this is also about future generations. What are we going to leave them with? And a bit of legacy. We talked this morning about crisis. Are we in crisis? Yes, we're in crisis. There's no question that we are not in crisis. In one of our events, a roundtable event that we organized last year, I spoke to one of the leaders in the IMF, and I really appreciated their honesty because essentially this person said, we don't know what to do anymore with the economy. The things that used to work in the past are not working anymore. And he said, sometimes we just kind of cross our fingers and hope that it works. And I say that with all respect, but I do respect the honesty that was there. Another thing that I see with regards to crises is new technologies are changing the way that we're going to do business, and they're already in effect right now. World Economic Forum report says that by 2030, there will be a situation where 25% globally of the adult working population will be out of a job at any one time. So yes, there are challenges that we have, and challenge is also crisis. So whether we like it or not, change is upon us, and it's influencing how we do business. And I would really stand here and just say, so let's take the opportunity, since things are changing anyway, they will have to change, to investigate a different way of doing things. I do see opportunities as we are here to talk about mutuality this weekend. One of the things that I see is during our European Economic Summit event in 2014, we talked about mutuality, we talked about the central role of relationships, and it's an idea whose time has come, has been our experience, very, very much so. And especially in Europe, I think it's an idea whose time has come because it's kind of close to the European spirit in that sense, empowering people. How we've seen that catch on, literally, is for example, even before I stepped in the plane on the way here, got a letter from The Hague or an email from The Hague asking me to come and to speak to them about the things that are being discussed here this weekend on mutuality. In the 2 years since the previous meeting that we held, terms like relationships in the economy and mutuality are starting to turn up much more often in the national press. It's captured the heart. It's starting to influence the thinking, at least within our government systems, also within some of our CEOs. It's starting to make people ask the question, is this viable? Should we think about how much profit is enough? Now, I have been asked, indeed, just to state my own vision as we start this discussion on what can and should we expect of responsible businesses. And I'd like to just present you very, very quickly our own statement that we've been working on called Business as a Force for Good. Business should create opportunity. It promotes a world of justice and liberty for all. Business should serve mankind. It should steward resources and create wealth for present and future generations. Business should seek the good of all stakeholders and not just the shareholders. It takes an active role in the economic development and human flourishing of its employees and the communities it serves. Business should tread softly, should minimize environmental footprint and nurture the environment. Business should embrace rights as well as responsibilities and work to bring solutions to global problems. We haven't always lived up to this, but this should be a vision that inspires us. And why? Because we're committed to a better future. I think as I just end this, I'd like to say and leave a challenge. It's not whether or not business should do it. We know that business is able to address these things. And so maybe the question we should be asking is why not? Thank you.
Thank you. Frank Akers is now going to make a 5-minute statement. And Frank, you're going to tell us about
what can and should be.
Well,
Got it.
how Mars has actually taken a responsible approach to thinking about responsible business.
And actually, I don't think it's any different than today. And I focus on transparency when I say that. Now, transparency conjures up a lot of things for different people. And I'm reminded of a story about a naval operation. And it was a large formation of ships, and in that formation, everybody had a certain position to maintain. And there was a new captain who had his first command. And as opposed to sitting in his position in the formation, he began to maneuver in and out of the formation. And the admiral aboard the aircraft carrier in the center of the formation watched as long as he could tolerate. And he called the radio man and he said, "Send the signal to the captain and tell him those are the most stupid, idiotic maneuvers I have ever seen. Cease and desist immediately." So the radio man dutifully sent the message, and it's received on the destroyer, and the young radio man there grabs it and runs up to the bridge, and he tells the captain, "I have a message from the admiral. Could you step over here with me and let me tell you what it is?" And the young captain, feeling very good, says, "Read it out loud." The young radio man's a pretty smart guy. He says, "Sir, you come over here with me and let me give you the message first." No luck. The captain keeps telling him to tell everyone the message. So dutifully, the radio man says, from the admiral, "Those are the most stupid, idiotic maneuvers I have ever seen. Cease and desist immediately." The young captain, without breaking a breath, says to the radio man, "Very good. Take that message below decks and decode it right now." Now, when we talk about transparency, there's a certain decoding that has to take place there. Because saying that we want transparency and believe in transparency is much different than being comfortable with transparency. So how do we get comfortable with transparency? Well, each of us as individuals does it in a different way. But each of us as a collective in companies also do it in different ways. You know, recently a lot of articles about Ed Catmull and Pixar and Disney and his idea of setting up the Brain Trust, where every movie that is produced by those studios comes before a very critical review group, and he calls it the Brain Trust. Now, initially when he started that, everybody was fearful, but they've now had 17 #1 box office sellers in a row. Do you think people ask to be reviewed now? Absolutely. Well, the same thing happened within Mars with the economics of mutuality. You know, as with any new idea, these things go back and forth. And there are proponents and opponents and folks in the middle and folks who don't want to say anything. So Mars decided that the best thing to do was let's have an external review. Let's get some thoughts of how we can gain from what others think about our concept of economics of mutuality. Well, one of the jobs as the external co-chair of the Mars Science Advisory Council is to participate and set up external reviews and after-action reviews. Now, this was a pretty sensitive topic, as you might imagine, inside of Mars. So I said, well, let's see who we ought to have on this review panel. So we got the director of the Paris School of Economics, the head of McKinsey Europe, the James B. Duke Professor of Economics at Duke, the head of the School of Engineering at Southern Methodist University, the director of sustainability for the U.S. Peace Institute, the vice chairman of Walmart, the head of marketing for the Harvard Business School, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Now, you pass through this and you recognize that one of the requirements for transparency is to be prepared to be comfortable with criticism, okay? If you don't want to be criticized, don't be transparent, because it's gonna happen. And you need to prepare yourself for it. So just as now, and actually we had another external review following that one 2 years later to check the progress, et cetera, et cetera. As a matter of fact, this is probably the third external review for the economics of mutuality with all of you as reviewers, okay? And what a great opportunity to have a concept examined. Now, when you do this and you run after action reviews, keep in mind that you look at the good things as well as the bad. And there are many projects where people say, we accomplished this at the end, but the road was bumpy to get there. So let's figure out how to smooth the road. So look at transparency, use it as a guiding principle, but don't be afraid to be criticized. Thank you. Avishay.
Look here, your timer is here.
Thank you. I want to speak to the students because they are the future. And my advantage on the students is that I'm 68 and I went through, you know, I got my PhD at Stanford. I was idealistic like you in 76. I went for 14 years to the World Bank. 16 years I led Transformation University. And 9 years I was in politics until I left a year ago. And what did I learn from that? You know, it's tough for you. Because I listened to Emmanuel Faber speaking here. We are in a crisis. The world is totally unjust. The CO2 is knocking on the door. And with all the respect for politicians, you know, I used to joke in my own country that tactic is out to appear in the afternoon news, and strategy is out to appear in the nightly news. Today is Twitter. We are mostly working for the short term, looking at the new modern selection of politicians. I don't want to mention the United States today. So in a way, the modern corporation are people are looking as the modern king to save humanity. And here, I come here, why I'm here? Because a year ago in Jerusalem, by mistake or providence, I met Bruno and Jay, and I fell in love with them, and then we started having a relationship. Because all my life, what I learned in life, it's all about people. It's about teams of transformation and about serving elite. I don't believe so much in the wisdom of the public. The public can elect in America someplace, in the past in Europe, many other places. I believe, like Mr. Goyer in Singapore, if you have a serving elite that can come from the poor, they can come from the rich, but they have certain values in which they say we work for the future. But let me first start with my mind, because like people here, I come with passion, with humility, and hopefully with hope. When I use my economist mind, I'm in trouble. Because the truth of the matter, many years ago, I brought one of my mentors, the Nobel laureate in economics, Kenneth Arrow, he's 94 now, to my university, and he gave a talk to the faculty why economists should be humble. You know, economics, I talk to the students, economics is a subject that is dynamic, is stochastics, multi-agent. You cannot extend theorems when you move from 3 players to 4 players. There are institutions, and Danny Kahneman got the Nobel Prize by providing evidence that the postulates of economics about rationality are irrelevant for human behavior. But economics is culture of persuasion with discipline that can help, but it's a culture of persuasion. But today, we have a major dilemma. Now, I look at here, am I inspired when I look at Novodisc with Goran, and I look at Faber, and I look at Mars. These are people that are morally inclined in a culture that still admire the quarterly account and mostly select leaders that are narcissists, that have a PR agenda, and they run the universe. So there are rooms to be very pessimistic about the future. Where I gain my optimism? I gain my optimism for 3 reasons. One, my mother was a kindergarten teacher. She say, Avishay, you have to be optimist, otherwise you'll get ulcer, cancer, so it's better to be optimistic. Second, I look at the young generation, and when I left politics, I have many, many people coming. There is fantastic young generation. I have hope for them. And I look at the people here that don't give up, because eventually it's not giving up. And I have my hope not from extrapolation that is either linear or non-linear, because the most likely estimate that we have major disasters on the environment and politically and maybe wars. But I have my hope from quantum physics and from string theory and from Buddhism and from Jesus and from Moses and from Khalil Gibran. You can take it from wherever you want. because event with low probability happen. It may not be what we forecast, because economic forecasting, Bernard, make astrology looks good, you know that. You make economic forecasting, what happened yesterday will happen tomorrow, plus epsilon minus delta, you miss all the other things. So therefore, and I'm in conclusion, therefore I believe that if there are leadership, that's what I went to politics and I didn't find it, so I decided to try to move out. When you have a team of people that are committed to something, that they know it's not about their ego and their narcissism, but for that you have to have either, right now, family business, with moral leadership at the top. You have to have a foundation like you in Denmark, when the people, we see Goran and we see you. And when you look at Danone, I was surprised, because usually in public company, it's a lot more difficult, because you measure by the quarterly account. So how do we create a culture of transforming leadership that go against the current until a new system will be devised? What do I take from here? Measurement is important. What Bruno, Jay, and Colin did is important. But measurement is not the thing. The thing is to create a serving elite of people that, in spite the current, they will transform business, and then maybe will transform politics. I found that it's very difficult to change the world. Everybody has to take and change his microenvironment. We have a war in the world between the agent of hope and the agent of fear and the agents of greed. And the agents of fear and the agents of greed are winning. But we shouldn't give up. For me, I go back to my own country, and I brought with me, you saw Itzik Zivan and Dr. Muhammad El-Nabari, one of the most successful graduates of my university, a PhD in chemistry, and we are committed to transform the Bedouins in the northern Negev in the shared space of the Jews, because while in 16 years I was blessed by God to lead all the transformation for the area, for high tech and growth, we open it for the Bedouins, but it's not sufficient. But since you have leaders like Muhammad El-Nabari, Itzik Zivan, and others, we are committed to do so, and we may come to ask your advice in that matter. God bless you, and thank you very much.
Navi. Thank you.
All right, so I'm the last guy standing between you and your lunch, so I will try to kind of speed up the pace of my presentation today in the next 5 minutes. In today's highly competitive, winner-takes-all market environment, businesses engage each other in a zero-sum game that can be ruled by the formula 1 + 1 = 0. In India, where I come from, however, we have a saying that 1 + 1 = 11, meaning that the whole is larger than the sum of the parts. Cooperation and interdependence form the basis of the Indian society, which is extremely diverse. So diverse that we have over 30 million gods in our pantheon. You can just pick and choose, or you can even create your own god if you like. The economics of mutuality can be summed up as the formula 1 + 1 = 11. All the case studies presented yesterday are about responsible businesses that don't selfishly compete for a tiny share of a small pie. Rather, they engage public, private, and nonprofit partners to co-create a much larger pie for everyone to share. Becoming a responsible business is a journey, as we heard. It's a journey where business evolves from 1 + 1 = 0 to 1 + 1 = 11. Despite all the goodwill, many responsible businesses I've studied and worked with have only risen from level, I would say, up to the level 1 + 1 = 3, maybe 4. They may have made the pie slightly larger, but not significantly bigger for everyone. So the question is, how do we go up to the level of 1 + 1 = 11? In my next book, based on many case studies I studied, I identified 2 things company can do to evolve from a good responsible business to a great responsible business. First, you have to shift the perspective. Rather than viewing a country as a market from a narrow corporate perspective, you have to evaluate the company from the broader perspective of the society where you operate. That way, you can measure and improve your contributions to things that actually matter for citizens in the society. That's exactly what the industrial firm Siemens is starting to do from this year. Rather than think and act narrowly as a business to customer, B2C, or business to consumer company, B2B, Siemens is learning to operate as a business to society, B2S entity, as the CEO, Joe Kaeser, calls it. Siemens operates in over 190 countries. For each country, they plan to apply this business to society framework to identify national priorities in 6 broad areas: driving economy, developing local skills and jobs, value-adding innovations, sustaining the environment, improve quality life, and supporting long-term social transformation. Each year, Siemens will measure how well they contribute to each country they operate in those 6 areas, identify the gaps, and proactively invest in the skills and partnership required to increase their contribution. This year, they successfully piloted this business to society framework in South Africa, and they're rolling it out in other countries in the coming years. So that is about broadening your perspective. The second thing to do, I think, is to deepen the perspective by cultivating a spirit of generosity. So we spoke about love, we spoke about passion, we spoke about humility. I think generosity is an important quality to have if you want to partake in economic mutuality. Now, mutuality is not just reciprocity, which is merely a transactional give and take. Mutuality is rooted in generosity. Like in any great relationship, you have to learn to give more than you receive. What if you apply generosity to the environment? What if you learn to give back to nature, for instance, much more than she gives you? This is what a consumer goods company in the US is doing. For the past 20 years, they drastically reduced the carbon footprint. Now they're trying to radically increase the ecological handprint, as Harvard professor Greg Norris calls it, giving back to nature 5 times up to 10 times the resources they consume. For instance, they are setting up factories that not only are zero waste and run on renewable energy, but can generate up to 10 to 12 eco-positive services like creating potable water for local communities. So the factory, which is the symbol of industrial decline, can become a shining beacon of sustainable and restorative enterprise. These 2 case studies I presented are from a book I'm publishing in September called The Rise of the Frugal Society, Reinventing How We Consume, Live, and Work. In this book, I argue that the sole purpose of business is not to maximize profit, but to maximize the well-being and potential of each one in a society while preserving precious resources for future generations. Thank you very much.
Great. So the treat now is that I'm opening the floor for everyone to ask as many questions as we can fit in 30 minutes. We have an opportunity maybe to go back on some of the previous panels as well, if you want, and have 30 minutes of discussion. So raise your arm if you're interested. This gentleman there.
Thank you. I've been paying attention to this project since its beginning, intrigued by the commitment to be bold, courageous architects of the future, as we heard argued this morning. There's a profound convergence between the economics of mutuality and the conditions required for long-term profitability and for human flourishing in the 21st century. But all along the way, the economics of mutuality has had its critics, more often than not born of a cynicism that's cancerous to individuals and to institutions everywhere. In a word, it's the perennial spirit of real économique. Please, this may be a nice conversation for ivory towers, but in the real world of money and markets, responsibility and mutuality are irrelevant. I've even heard this argued on the edges of this forum. We live in a world of whatever, where everything and nothing is right, real and true and right. But this forum has argued otherwise, in many different ways, making the case that responsibility and mutuality matter for the good work of the marketplace. In fact, that they are integral, written to the very meaning of a healthy global marketplace. My question is this: why are they? Why do they matter? Why do responsibility and mutuality mean so much for the making of M&Ms and so much more? And then, how is this conversation to have consequences into the future?
Any question? The gentleman there on the left.
My question is to Mr. Navi. In your book, Jugaad and Frugal Innovation, you make a very strong case that large corporations are inherently inefficient when it comes to innovation. If I change the same question to responsible business and sustainability, what's your take or what's your observation in terms of who is geared better, bigger organization or small startup, when it comes to the pursuance of responsible business and sustainability? Thank you.
Thank you. Great question. Please go ahead. The mic is coming. You can
Hello.
introduce yourself, sorry.
Yeah, so my name is Thomas. I work for Mars in strategy, and my question is the following. It's to Mrs. Westerhof. You mentioned this lost generation. My question is, when I look at all the big companies today, is they all focused on cost savings, basically efficiency. And my question is very simple. Do you believe that focusing on cost savings, reducing overheads, and basically putting more and more people or giving less opportunities for jobs to people, do you believe that this is compatible with being a responsible business?
Thank you. Navi, do you want to start maybe?
So I can address.
Yeah, you can
address. Yeah, of course, very quickly. So I think, again, one of the big takeaway from this forum, I hope, is that I think several people mentioned is that we have to move away from this very dualistic view of, either or. It's like, either, small companies can do really well innovation or responsible business, and then large companies are corrupt and completely selfish. I used to think that way, and I think maybe at 45, it's okay to have a shift in heart or in mind. But actually, I think, what we have to move towards is actually thinking about how these two sectors can come together, which is essentially how can large companies learn to better team up and partner with startups to actually carry out their responsible business agenda. So that is what I'm looking at actually living in Silicon Valley, is that you begin to see actually many large companies now setting a presence in Silicon Valley to not just kind of import or bring technologies from these startups, but imbibe themselves with the kind of agile, more kind of nimble culture of Silicon Valley. So I would just say that essentially more than ever we're entering an era of interdependence. So instead of viewing like Silicon Valley or the startup world as being a rival or almost like somebody who is pioneering a different kind of paradigm, I think we should think about how large companies can actually practice what we call open innovation, which is really like opening up to the outside world and team up with unconventional, unusual kind of small companies.
Great. Avishay?
I'll refer to the question that was addressed here. You see, I think Professor Vines discussed it before. Business schools usually, and assuming by being a little bit brutal in order to wake the public, often you go to INSEAD, you go to Harvard, you go to Stanford, you go to Oxford. You get yourself the good network, and then you set for life. And the idea of all of a sudden to take young people from business school that want to be successful and tell them, no, you also have to be moral in business, and then they go into the game and they don't go to Danona, they don't go to Mars, they don't go to Novardisk, and they see that the world behaves differently and they have to navigate. That is your question. Somehow, the revolution that have to take place, and maybe evolution, and the Berbers are knocking on the door, the time is running for us, is not only through leaders like you see today. I think somehow, as David Vines say, the education in economics have to be changed. Because something of the fundamentals of economics are not that simple anymore. Because in my chair said, somebody say everything is great about the free market. It is not. Because if we let the free market run today, the people are called Homo sapiens that behave often like killing monkey and consuming monkeys may finish themselves. And therefore some of the discussion, because as Bernard said, we have limited understanding of economics today. So somehow academia have to open up for the new possibilities. But here, while academia will try to change the concept in education, we try to correct capitalism. That's what the discussion here, to bring mutuality, to bring responsibility. Now there are two options. One is the fake one, because you go around, you go to Davos, you go to every place, all the world is full of the new social responsible people. Great CEO that don't walk the talk, they get something, and it's all in your language, in the bar. It's totally BS. Now the question is how to walk the talk like these people here, in spite of the environment, in spite of that the world may go in different place, and start preaching it, demonstrating it. It's tough. It's like a salmon, because with all the niceties here, it goes against the traffic. You go to many places, people say, take the money and run, short term, we master of the universe, and you measure it every day. So the responsibility is on Colin, on David, on people here, and eventually it's on the young generation. What we did is not working anymore. It's your responsibility with the people of Mars, with the people of Danona, with the people of Novordisk, and others that don't accept the current game as it is. That's my answer.
Thank you. Arleen, do you want to pick up on the specific question there was?
Okay, the question that was asked was indeed, is increasing efficiency in your company so that you actually need fewer employees, is that not contradictory to being a socially responsible company? I'd actually like to go a step further and say I think that that's a question that is coming from one of the paradigms that we're going to need to re-examine as we enter this new age of economics of, new economic thinking anyway, and doing, and also the realities that are upon us. I think that we've had yesterday a number of examples of companies who've made a conscious choice to incorporate both in their business practice. And I really do favor the fact that it's time to start asking ourselves how much is enough. And I really liked what was said this morning, that it's not so much about accepting sometimes a lower return on investment as it is about convergence. And that's where we're heading towards. So that would be my answer to that question.
Thank you. We have time, which is unusual for me to say that, but we have time for more questions. So the gentleman there, Bertrand, a third hand. The gentleman with the light blue jumper.
Good. Can you hear me?
Yes.
I'd like to ask Simon Walker a hard version of Avishay Braverman's question and the question raised earlier by Daniel Hurstel. Simon was encouraging us to think that boards contain people who do what this whole 2 days has been about. They think they're not just, he said, concerned with short-run profit maximizing. They have a sense of wider responsibility. We should be generous to Simon. He talked the talk, and this is a sense of what a board might do. And now let's just ask him the following question. When there was the Pfizer bid for AstraZeneca last year, in the end, we know that that was rejected by a board who had a sense of the obligation. There's a research lab in Cambridge, hugely important for the structure of science and progress of this country. And the board rejected the offer. And I have been told that the 5 leading fund managers very nearly launched a class action against the board. And I have been told that those leading fund managers, when examined about this, said, get real, Cambridge Science Lab? Forget it. We wanted the bid premium. Now, how is Simon confident that his talk actually ends up on our side? I'm not confident yet. For all that he tells us cheerfully in favour of this and that, I don't think fund managers will let his talk deliver anything of the kind that we need. Could you please answer me, Simon?
He's not here, but I'm sure somebody will want to step in. I'm sure somebody will volunteer to step in on his behalf, or maybe not. But let's keep that question and ask the gentleman with the light jumper. And then this gentleman there.
My name is Cedric. I work for the Corporate University of Mars. And my question is around defining the boundaries of a responsible business. In the last 1.5 days, we've been working very hard to push the boundaries of what a business is supposed to do, looking beyond our walls and putting our sights on an ecosystem that is embracing more and more stakeholders, talking about the business as if it were a human being or an actual person and needing to have a spirituality or a soul. So how can we create new boundaries? Where do they stop if we want to be pragmatic as we are idealists?
Thank you. Bertrand, and then you're making mental note of this question, are you? I hope you are. Yeah, if you can give it to Bertrand and then the gentleman down here.
I just have a kind of transversal question. I think we had diverse panel, but at the end of the day, as Avishay say, it's about Oxford, Harvard, Stanford, etc. Are we discussing between Western people about Western values to the rest of the world, or are we missing something? I'm sorry, I'm a bit blunt. I remember 20 years ago, I worked on that, and I had a conversation on the 10 Commandments, and people agree that in most culture, you shall not kill is okay. You don't kill. I mean, but when you start to say you shall not steal, it starts to be much more complex, because then you enter into what is a fair price? Are you stealing the consumer when you, et cetera, et cetera. So the world is way more complex. So how can we kind of expand from being between Western educated people and one another to really a global capitalism, which is in dear need of reform?
There seems to be a lot of wisdom in India, but yes, is the economics of mutuality transferable culturally? Please. Hold on, the mic is coming.
Thank you. So I think you mentioned about the lost generation. And I remember reading a paper in my undergrad in economics about the race between technology and education. Because what happens is that you have a lot of really smart, technically inclined people, for example, in Silicon Valley, doing startups, creating a lot of amazing technology. And these are the top people. They're accruing a lot of income to capital. But at the same time, this capital is actually displacing jobs at the bottom of the pyramid. The bottom quintile of people are actually losing jobs because of the flush of technology going into society. So how do you balance this race between technology and education? So.
Great, thank you. So a challenge to Simon on the wisdom of the shareholders, the new boundaries of business, and what are the parameters within which we can reasonably expect business to play the role of government, and what are the implications for that? Is our view of the world transferable across multiple culture, and the trade-off between job creation emergence of new technologies. So take your pick, and
well, I think the question on what the boundaries are, I think the Mahindra case study does a good job of looking at what is the ecosystem around what you're looking at, and your business and your culture and your situation, so that it can be examined in detail and then put together holistically. And I'm not sure that at this point you can look at the whole thing as one entity, but it would take going to pieces of it, putting that together, and then creating the ecosystem.
Any other comments on that point?
I'll just say that I think the question also reveals that maybe we need to change the self-perception of what is a business. And I think that most of the metaphors used today come from, I would say, influenced by the laws of Newtonian physics, very mechanistic view of a company, which is really about using inputs like resources and then generate outputs, which for me is very much from a paradigm of industrial evolution. I think borrowing from biological metaphor may be more apt in the sense that if you view a business as essentially a tree, And if you think about the tree with branches and producing fruits, of course you have to produce juicier, bigger fruits. That's pretty much the business, of course. But the tree actually rests on roots, and the roots is the society. So if the roots are rotting with income inequality and the soil, which is nature, is degrading, you are screwed, right? So it's almost like an obligation or kind of self-preservation instinct that should drive you to say, the more the foundation is stable, the more productive I can become, right? So I think that's why I talked about this business to society concept. And the second example I'm giving away from my book is what if you think business as nature? So literally start thinking of business like a factory as a forest. So we have to also, maybe in the next forum next year, is rethink about, is it about business we are talking about, or do we need a new metaphor to talk about business as a living organism instead of anything else?
Interesting. 30 seconds. I'm looking at the business leaders and I'm looking at incentives. We can look at business as a tree. We can look at it as everything. The question comes to the players, what's their incentive structure? And unless the leaders of the corporation, the debate, sometimes it's CEO, sometimes it's dominant chairman, that affect the incentive towards the long term. If that doesn't exist, it doesn't matter how we define the corporation. It will become a very nice intellectual conversation in Oxford. So therefore, the agents of change, the leadership in the corporation academia, have to work toward the transformation of incentive that, yes, we work for the long term, and even if the quarterly accounts are bad, we are continuing. And that exists only if you see people like that, no matter if we define business. You remember the discussion about government. I was in the World Bank, late 70s, Bertrand. Everything was about shadow pricing. You remember? I lead a lot, because there is negative externalities, you evaluate project with a shadow price for the labor, for everything, and you evaluate project. It didn't work. You have to have leadership that affect the decision, that is not corrupt, that is moral, and that's the tough part that exists in this room in order to extend this group. Then you can live on trees.
But is there not also, on this question of traditional boundaries of business, is there not also an issue of equity, of fairness? I mean, if business start providing health and education services to the community that they're concerned with, the smallholder farms, cocoa farms, is there the risk that that community get privileged by the business intervention at the expense of another community that doesn't receive the benefit from local governments? I mean, I don't know if that's what you were touching on, but I think it is an important question.
I think with regards to that is something that needs to be considered very, very strongly. And that's one of the things that I've liked about what I've heard here in a number of the case studies that were done today. I didn't hear answers because those answers are not easy to come by. Even the gentleman from Danone this morning who said, it's just because this woman buys her milk. I know it's a slightly different situation. The other one is going to be negatively affected. I think history is full of examples that when we want to do good, there is kind of an equal and an opposite reaction in another field. And I think personally, that's why it's really, really important as we move forward on this to consider the ecosystem and also to make sure that that is very well built into whatever approaches are taken in the future.
Great. So are we in an eco chamber, which is your question, Bertrand? Are we talking among ourselves, and how the economics of mutuality translate across other cultures?
I mean, I guess coming from India, I guess the notion of inclusiveness is pretty much embedded. I think it's, given the diversity, right? So unity is something that you do because it's not nice, but it's essentially vital for, kind of survival of the culture and the society. So I think it's something that actually resonates really well, of course, in a lot of these, I would say, Asian society as well. But I think the interesting challenge I see is that almost like a dichotomy, right? Because in the West, essentially, we have developed, an economic system which is pretty much led by, large companies today. And in emerging markets, especially like India, we don't have that kind of those gigantic corporations. Many of them are small, medium businesses, and in a way, they have a lot more of that kind of sensibility to, society and environment. But as they develop, the question is, and this is what excites me, is what if we can help these emerging market companies to embrace the responsible business concept as the blueprint for essentially scaling up. So that way, essentially, instead of us in the West trying to unlearn and fix all the mess we have done, in the last, 2 centuries, maybe we should help also in a way, maybe in the next forum at Oxford, actually have 50% of the case studies coming from emerging markets and 50% of the people on the panel being from emerging markets, because today 2/3 of middle-class consumers are in India and China. By 2030, 2/3 of them will be in Asia, and by 2050, 80% of them will be in Asia and Africa. So we need to essentially, I think, long term.
Thank you. I've actually slightly lost track of time, so I'm going to have to conclude and invite the MBA student, Sean Peters and Safia Tapa. But
for 10 seconds, because there is this Spanish poet, Antonio Machado, that some of you know, that wrote Border of Dream, and he said, "Traveler, there is no path. The path is made by walking." And that's the answer. Yeah.